Much of the ancient and medieval world didn't ask the modern world's epistemic questions. Descartes starts to ask these questions. Philosophy will go in the domain of kind of setting metaphysics aside. Descartes didn't think to question the metaphysics of time or what it means for a thing to occur. Right. So Kant has this really devastating critique to just point, are you really doubting everything? Because like you haven't doubted time and time determination, right?
Well, and Kant also critiques him in regards to he's a thinking substance. So he's still evoking these first principle categories of foundationalism from Aristotle, yet he's claiming that he's going to do away with these things.
Modern epistemology tends to date from Descartes, and Descartes is important because his idea was to seek after indubitable certitude. So he wants in his system and his philosophy this reply to potential skepticism, this way to have indubitable certainty by doubting everything he thought he could. And so he's, if you read the meditations, he'll go through these. I think there's 5. I'm going from memory. It's been 15 years since I read meditations, but he'll go through these meditations kind of doing a series of questioning of presuppositions. So in one way, we can appreciate Descartes for doing what philosophy tends to do, which is question presuppositions, right? We go all the way back to Socrates walking around Athens in the Apology, questioning everybody's assumptions. So that's kind of the enterprise of philosophy, is to do that. I think in varying degrees, perhaps we can always appreciate different philosophers for different insights and in different ways. Maybe not everybody has, maybe not all the philosophers have that many great things to say, but at least most of the known philosophers have some point that we can appreciate. And so on one level, we can understand and appreciate Descartes' desire to not be duped, to not be deceived by the information of his senses, and to try to question as far down as he could. Of course, I don't believe ultimately that, and I think most philosophers even since Kant, have critiqued his approach to strong foundationalism as being basically a failed attempt. It doesn't work. But we can appreciate the attempt and the enterprise and the desire here. And so the reason that we go to Descartes is because he's kind of the first figure to raise these questions and posit what would be called strong foundationalism. So strong foundationalism wants to ground knowledge in the indubitable, the highest possible degree of certitude, such that it could not be doubted. And so his approach then seeks to whittle down, right? And we also have to kind of understand a little bit of the ancient and medieval metaphysic and epistemology, because the ancient and medieval world did do a kind of epistemology. They did do, propositional logic with Aristotle. They did do epistemic types of questions in the Middle Ages. You have the hooded man paradox and these kinds of questions that related to epistemology. But much of the ancient and medieval world didn't ask the modern world's epistemic questions. And the reason they didn't is because there were assumptions that had not yet really been asked or probed. And so they would put in their order of philosophy, you could say, metaphysics first. We do metaphysics, and anything that might pertain to epistemology comes down the road. So it's a secondary kind of question. And if you guys saw the debate with Trent, a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight will pertain to and came up in that debate. And so the approach that I had was to ask and raise these more modern questions to people that typically don't know those questions or have sufficient answers to those questions. Because what happens is that when Descartes starts to ask these questions, philosophy will go in the domain of kind of setting metaphysics aside.
Right.
And not to say that necessarily there's no metaphysics or we don't know it, but that, hey, wait a minute, we're going to have to answer these epistemic questions before we can claim to know the metaphysical stuff. Right. Because the epistemic questions are prior.
Right.
And in many ways, this is kind of a revolutionary question and approach. A lot of people in the ancient medieval world had not really thought in that way. There's inklings of it. There are transcendental arguments in Aristotle and John Damascus and so forth, but there hadn't really been a questioning at the level of the discipline of epistemology to the degree that Descartes and people after him will begin to do. Right. And so one thing that we should distinguish from the outset that a lot of people have a misunderstanding over, and of course, everybody misunderstands terminology a lot, but when we speak of having a foundational belief, okay, that's not the same thing as foundationalism. Right. Just like having empirical sense data is not the same thing as empiricism.
Right.
And even in the Trent debate, he misunderstood terms and he confused them with schools of thought.
Yep.
So when I said Thomas Aquinas was an empiricist in his approach to sense data, he assumed that I was saying that Thomas Aquinas was a Humean empiricist, as if he was, which is, I was like, no, there's a difference between believing that your starting point is sense data and being a Humean empiricist, right? So not every school of thought is identical to, just like transcendental arguments aren't identical to Kant.
Right. Phenomenalism is not the same thing as phenomenology.
Yeah. Discussing, for example, objects in the realm of ideas is not idealism. If I make an argument on the basis of abstract ideas, doesn't mean that I'm idealist, right, like Plato or somebody. Okay. So we have to be very careful. And so the reason I say that is that depending on which philosophical view or worldview that we have, what we mean by a starting point or a foundational belief could be anything. And I might believe that everything is a foundational belief. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that, but somebody might say that if they're a coherence theorist, for example.
Right.
So the words foundational beliefs or starting points don't necessarily equate to foundationalism, or think about in the debate when I was using arguments about reasoning or logic, and Trent equated that with natural theology. So in his mind, natural theology is the same as making an argument. Like, no, that's not the same thing, right? Natural theology is connected to this idea in your system, the ways to find, of strong foundationalism. And thank God that in the debate, Trent himself actually went on to define his epistemology in a strong foundationalist way. He even used Descartes' cogito as a valid argument, he thought. So anyway, so foundationalism in the Cartesian sense, strong foundationalism, is an attempt to basically say that all of our beliefs rest on not an infinite regress, but some basic starting point. Sometimes the term is doxastic basicality, meaning that there's no other more basic belief that you could go to, or other belief that you would reference to justify that basic starting point.
Right.
In the course of Descartes' philosophy, as you guys know, what he does is he says, all right, well, as I whittle this down to questioning my assumptions, the most basic thing that I can't question is that I have my own existence, right? I think, therefore I exist, or I am, or it's formulated in different ways. And the critiques of that, of course, I think are pretty easy to do, but both Kant in his day and later Bertrand Russell, I mean, there's been centuries of people really kind of devastating and doing devastating critiques of Descartes' cogito as an argument proving or demonstrating a strong foundationalist epistemology. So part of this too is the idea that in order to justify a position, or what it is to have true knowledge, if you're a strong foundationalist, means then that true knowledge, properly speaking, is identical to a chain of reasoning that is inferential from the properly basic starting points, or the self-evident maxims, or the axioms, or whatever you want to say. And they have to kind of be brought to mind. I mean, this is for you to be justified in your belief. And they have to basically build on an inference chain from that properly basic belief. Otherwise, the beliefs aren't justified. And so the problem, as you can begin to see with a strong foundationalist approach, is that that's a really tall order. I mean, do we really want to say that all of our beliefs have to immediately be present in our mind in an inferential chain of propositions referring back to or connected to necessarily that properly basic belief? I mean, this is kind of a ridiculous thing when you start to think about it. And before I move on, I do want to mention, so a couple classic critiques, for example, of Descartes' cogito and why it doesn't actually work would be, this has come up in multiple debates, came up with Trent, that came up with basically every debate I've had with an atheist or a Muslim or a Roman Catholic ends up on this point, because they all share whether it's T-Dump or whether it's Stefan Molyneux or whether it's Azrar Rashid or whether it was Trent Horn. Everybody has in their natural theology, the same strong foundationalist approach. And so it's just based on a bunch of really naive assumptions of a basic empiricism, that there's a basic imprinting of sense data, that there's the myth of the given, which we'll get to in a moment,
right.
That there's a privileged epistemic position that they have. I mean, all of these things are just assumed, and it's in many ways, and this is not meant as a pejorative, but it's a very naive position,
right?
Meaning that it has a whole lot of assumptions that are arbitrary and they don't want you to question them. So, for example, in Descartes' Cogito, we'll use that as a case study of a bad, strong foundationalist argument. Descartes' claim, I think, therefore I exist. He thought that there's not really any other way to go lower in doubting. There's nothing else I can doubt. That just has to. It just seems to be self-evident, right? And the first critique that I think is the strongest critique would be from later philosophers who point out that it's actually a non sequitur. So the fact that that thinking exists or that thinking is occurring does not grant you a metaphysical claim of existence, right, or knowledge of the self.
Right.
In other words, what is the I that's there in that first part of the sentence, right? That leads to the conclusion that there's a metaphysically existing thing, right?
Right.
So it's a non sequitur is the sort of the immediate classic critique. Kant has a really strong critique that when you say, I think, therefore I exist, you're making a statement about what is occurring. An occurrence is relates to time determination.
Right.
Occurring is a time determinate proposition or claim. And Descartes' doubting has not yet said anything about time, right, and space, which are heavily debated philosophy topics between Kant, Newton, different people, right? Radically different philosophies of time. So time is part of one's metaphysic. And again, we see that Descartes didn't think to question the metaphysics of time or what it means for a thing to occur.
Right.
So Kant has this really devastating critique to just point out that, are you really doubting everything? Because like you haven't doubted time and
right,
time determination, right?
Well, and Kant also critiques him in regards to he's a thinking substance. So he's still evoking these first principle categories of foundationalism from Aristotle, yet he's claiming that he's going to do away with these things. What can I not doubt? Yet at the same time, by saying that I think, therefore I am, and then res cogito tans, that he's a thinking thing. Well, you're now invoking soul substance concepts that are metaphysical a priori. Now, again, we are not Kantians, but Kant's critique dealing with, and this is where we're going to move into, maybe you can highlight a little bit of why Descartes in this rationalist and the empiricism that's going to come from Locke, how these are breaking from Aristotle. And then move into Hume and induction, and why, because now we're going to be questioning causality and identity through space and time. Again, these metaphysical categories, if we're really going to question everything, let's question everything. That's what Hume will do. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So, and many, as I said, there's many other critiques that are important too. For example, a lot of people, especially, for example, the sort of classically minded people that are Thomists or whoever, a lot of those guys are not aware of linguistic philosophy, and in the last 3 centuries, especially since Giambattista Vico is kind of the first figure to really begin to question linguistic assumptions.
Right.
And in the progress of Western philosophy, this really comes to the forefront with Wittgenstein, where you have people really just kind of going crazy into pointing out, all of these assumptions that go into language and meaning and predication. And so it's just a fact of people's ignorance that you have to have no knowledge of linguistic philosophy at all and its questions to think that Descartes' cogito is a self-evident maxim. I mean, what's so obvious here that he hasn't questioned? Language.
Exactly.
Right. So a whole other level of critique in the next few centuries will come along with the linguistic philosophers to question at another level and say, hey, wait a minute. Even if we question these metaphysical claims and the epistemic claim in the cogito, I mean, what about sentences, man? I mean, to say this, to claim that this is the case, already is assuming that sentences and words have meaning.
Right.
Of course, Descartes this is an example of something that, people didn't question that yet.
And he
right?
represents this domino effect of this critical philosophy, this critical analysis. Then somehow we're going to get to more and more precise or certainty through this critical analysis. And so he's the first domino that really drops in regard to this tradition. But eventually, as you said, it's going to just continue to be more and more and more and more critical until it becomes totally circular. And that's where we're going to end.